So let's get started. So what is psychology? First of all, chapter 1 is like a giant introduction to psychology. It's kind of like a table of contents for what we will be learning. So if you kind of look at this fun chart here, and you can go watch the video, it's on YouTube. It's just like a 10-minute like whiteboard video that I made. You can check that out if you like. So psychology, what is psychology? Well, first, psychology starts off with the name, psych meaning soul, and ology meaning the scientific study of something. So because psychology kind of spawned out of philosophy, they looked at psychology as the way that we think, the way that our emotions, as a separate part from biology. So it's kind of the soul. Whereas now, of course, more contemporary wise, we see psychology as part of the body, you know, the neurotransmitters, the way we're influenced. It's not so much that we're doing things based on the way we're influenced as much as the influence actually changes neurological structure, which then propels us to behave in a certain way. So we'll talk about that in a minute too. The definition of psychology is the scientific study of the mind and behavior. Psychology is a science, even though you will have people that will say psychology is not a real science. Well, we're a real soft science, okay? The reason why we call ourselves a soft science is because we cannot prove anything. Because the problem is we're working with human beings, and you can't have all your clinical conditions just perfect when you're working with human beings. So if I'm working with a chemical, or if I'm working with, you know, something that is in a laboratory, then a chemical laboratory, I can have my exact dosages, my exact amounts. I mix this with this happens. But the problem with human beings is, let's say I'm doing a drug study. I may have somebody who says, oh no, check the box, I don't drink alcohol, check the box, no, I don't smoke, check the box, no, I don't do this. And they leave my drug study and they go home, and the first thing they do is they have 2 glasses of wine. I don't know exactly. So I can only say that research supports that this works. So I can't say research has proven that this works. We hear that a lot in media. It's been proven that if you do this, it's been proven that if you exercise 30 minutes a day, you will have lower cholesterol, lower stress, better managed sugar levels with diabetes. We know this is true, but we still can't say it's been proven. We can only say that it's been statistically significant that it will help you. So we'll learn more about that in the next chapter. The first school of psychology that came along was structuralism. Structuralism with Wilhelm Wundt, these are the principles of psychology in 1873, established the first research lab. Okay, psychology was a study of conscious experience through introspection. Introspection was actually coined by Socrates, so that goes way back. Okay, but structuralism kind of carried it on. Structuralism attempted to kind of study us based on our experiences. But the dilemma is with structuralism is that my experience may not be the same as Logan's experience or Jenny's experience or Betty's experience, right? Because let's say that Betty is 16 years old, I'm 47 years old, and I go to a restaurant and sit down. The service I get may be different than the service Betty gets based on stereotypes of 16-year-olds not tipping. So you just don't know her experience, even though the exact same thing is happening. Our views may be different, even coming down to eating foods. Banana ice cream, I don't like it at all, but my daughter loves it. So that's a same experience. We're both spooning our face with the same scoop of ice cream, but we have a different result or a different response. So it's hard to study experiences because they're so subjective to the person. So then came functionalism. Functionalism, and by the way, to memorize this, remember WW structuralism, Wilhelm Wundt structuralism, because remember your exams are multiple choice, meaning that they're recognition. So you want to attach WJ, William James, functionalism. So William James is an American psychologist. He was interested in kind of Darwin's theory. So he was very interested in how do we adapt? What is our function? How do we function, right? And so he kind of said, how do we adapt to our environment? He also used introspection as a stream of consciousness, kind of looking at the way that we think and how that influences who we are and become. But he looked at things more as a whole. So he didn't just take little pieces of experiences, but trying to see things more holistically. Functionalism also didn't really cover everything that it needed to with regards to trying to answer the question of who and why are we. So along came psychoanalysis. Now, psychoanalysis is perhaps what you'll learn the most about in the field of psychology in the beginning. It branches off and starts to fade away after a while. But the reason why we learn so much about psychoanalysis and Freud is because he was the first to create a comprehensive personality development or theory of development for people. Even though we do not subscribe to that theory of development anymore, his psychosexual stages, they're kind of out the door with, I'd say 99% of people in the field out the door. You do have a few Freudians that kind of float around that are left who've kind of held on to that theory, but pretty much everyone has let it go for the not true that it is. It's just very not accurate. But it was one of the first, and so we study this. And there's also, it's dominated the clinical world for decades, and we still do see psychoanalysis. For example, dream interpretation, free association, talking about slips of the tongue. In a clinical practice, you will still talk about individuals' dreams. Not the same as Freud would, which we'll learn later. We talk a little bit about Freud and dreams with latent and manifest content, but more so with what was your emotion during the dream? How do you interpret the dream? So not so much me sitting there with a pad saying, oh, you dreamed about a walrus? Well, this is what this means. It's not all the therapist at this point. It goes on to the client to explain how they are feeling. So this was very I'm right, you're wrong sort of centered type of view. So a psychoanalyst, if you say to a psychoanalyst, I missed a meeting with my mother, they would say, because you have hate towards your mother. And you would say, no, it's because my car wouldn't start. This is what you tell yourself, but this is not true. And so, so we'll learn more about Freud later. Very interesting stuff. For now, just know Freud, psychoanalysis, unconscious. Freud was very focused on the unconscious and childhood experiences. Then came Gestalt. So Gestalt kind of started to pull back and say, it's not just all, these unconscious motives that push us to be aggressive or push us to be, sexual or, push us to be pulled back, to not have a libido. It's not all sex, okay, Freud. There's more going on. So some psychologists came out and said that we need to look at things as a whole because that's what our minds are trying to do. So like, for example, if you look up at the clouds and you see kind of this shaped cloud and you say, oh my gosh, I see a giraffe in the clouds. It looks like a little giraffe. He's, a little monster. It's not really a giraffe. It's just a cloud. But our brain wants to kind of put that together. Kind of like this here. Some people see a rabbit. Some people see a duck. And one would argue you see that certain thing based on life experiences. Another great example is the woman, old woman, young woman. If you Google old woman, young woman illusion, you'll see that illusion. That's a Gestalt illusion. So you could check that out. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So if I were to ask you, what is the shape that's behind the triangle, you would say it's a rectangle. And this technically isn't a rectangle, but your brain makes it a rectangle because it closes it up. And that's kind of where the Gestalt therapist came in. Like we want to round everything off. We want to have everything connect. It continued to influence sensation and perception, obviously, and we don't study that chapter in this class, but it's a really cool chapter. You should read through it. Then comes behaviorism. Now, this is my favorite theory. Behaviorism, Ivan Pavlov. So think of Pavlov classical conditioning. So PCC, Pavlov classical conditioning, Watson, Skinner were the three biggest, biggest celebrities or theorists in this field. Ivan Pavlov discovered that we can condition, or we are conditioned, our emotions can be conditioned. So like, for example, if you hear like, dana, 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 they're like, what is that? Da-da-da-da. Like, we are conditioned to feel fear at the sound of that music. It has nothing to do with the music, but the music itself was paired with a shark eating your face, and so it created that fear. Then we have things like when traumatic events happen, we pair that with what's going on, creating fear. Or even like with chemotherapy, you know, if you're getting chemotherapy, you suddenly start getting nauseous on the way to the hospital. There's no reason for you to be getting nauseous, but you've made an association with the hospital, with the chemo treatment, which is what made you nauseous. So we're going to learn much more about classical conditioning. It is a really awesome concept. But for now, just chapter 1, learning the basics, kind of checking things out. Watson did a whole lot of studies with children and animals. His most famous study was a little boy named Little Albert, which we will learn about that study. And he saw how we could be conditioned to fear, but then he also saw that we were exhibiting behaviors to avoid that fear. Like, for example, when everyone rushed out to get toilet paper, that was a way to kind of people rushing out to get toilet paper was a way to kind of reduce that anxiety or fear by doing something they could control. So it's pretty cool. We'll talk about John Watson. Now, what he did, though, is he opened the door to that concept that other things are going on. And then Skinner came in and just ran with it. He came in and he showed us his ABCs, which is its antecedents, behaviors, and consequences. And he said, basically, for every antecedent, for everything that happens, there's a behavioral reaction to which there is a consequence, which subsequently may cause the behavior to increase or decrease. If a student asks me a question and I go, is there a reason you're interrupting me? It's pretty annoying. They're never going to ask me a question again. But if a student asks me a question, no matter how silly, let's say a student says, what time is it, Miss Brown? And I come back with, it's time for you to get a watch. You're interrupting me. That's rude, right? And so everyone in the class is going to be like, don't talk during class because Miss Brown's kind of rude. Nobody's going to talk. But if I come back with, well, it is, dun, da, 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 it is, I don't know what time it is because my watch isn't up, but it's 10, what is it? 10:00, whatever. Let's see. It's not 2:48. It's 10:22, right? If I just answer the question to the student, then it's kind of like, all right, cool. She answered that student's question. So if I ask a question, she'll be nice. So that would increase students' participation in class. Like at the end of class, it's like, I ask people, please share, ask questions. Even during class, people often will ask questions, and it's perfectly fine. All right, he created the Skinner box, which he likes to call the operant chamber. He doesn't like the name Skinner box. And we're going to learn so much more about this. It's an entire chapter dedicated to behaviorism. All right, next is humanism. There's not a chapter dedicated to humanism, but we do learn about Abraham Maslow, which is particularly important for education, business, and nursing, because they use marketing uses Maslow, education uses Maslow, and nursing for sure uses Maslow, because they kind of have a Maslow style when it comes to what's most important when first observing the patient, starting with respiratory, of course, and then moving on from there. So we're going to learn about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We're not going to cover Carl Rogers. We're going to talk a little bit about unconditional positive regard, which is awesome. It's where you respect the person, appreciate the person for the pure humanity of them, but not the behavior. So that way, if you have somebody, you're working with somebody, and they, and you could say to them, listen, as a person, I respect you. I am going to be kind to you, but I do not approve of your behavior. So that is kind of the unconditional positive regard, where you don't have to earn affection. Genuineness and empathy. This is kind of the style that Carl Rogers took with regards to therapy. I lean towards humanism. I do believe that if a person is given all the tools they need, they can become whatever their goal is to become. I also believe, however, that some goals are harder to obtain just because the job market's really small. So if somebody tells me they want to be, a manager, they want to work in management of a food chain, which is an awesome job, then I'd be like, oh yeah, you got that. Boom. That's going to take you 2 seconds. But if someone says, I want to be president of the United States, that's going to be a little bit harder because there's only one. There's only one. So it's a tiny little job market. So sometimes it's the market that holds people back, not necessarily the ability. So humanism helps people reach their fullest potential. So my daughter, for example, that's special needs, I want her to reach her fullest potential. And I'm going to push her to reach her fullest potential. And I'm going to be very proud of her, whatever that fullest potential is. So, and my middle daughter, who's an absolute genius, who is slacking right now, I'm like, come on, kid. Like, come on, kid. Like, you got the brain. Let's go. I'm going to push you a little bit harder. All right, so cognitive revolution. The cognitive revolution then came into play and said, you know what, we're talking an awful lot about feelings, an awful lot about sex, an awful lot about repressed memories and behavior, but we got to really get down to the science of it, okay? And this is where cognitive really dug into the scientific aspect of psychology. We can study behavior, we can study classical conditioning, obviously had a lot of scientific aspects to it. But this really got into looking at neuroscience, computer science, how our brains work like computers, memory, linguistics. So Chomsky, for example, came up with the LAD, which is language acquisition device. He believed is in our brains that we innately have the ability to learn language. This kind of reestablished connections with European psychologists, and Ulrich Neisser, which I probably am saying wrong, produced a textbook, Cognitive Psychology, in 1967. Pretty cool read, very dry, but interesting stuff, talking about how our brains function. And we'll talk a little bit about cognitive when we get into language and intelligence, like talking about algorithms and how we do things. I'm double checking my chat in case anybody's chatted anything. Nobody's chatted anything, but again, feel free to say, slow down, speed up, say that again. So, all right. Multicultural psychology. Multicultural psychology, this is the effect of culture on psychology understudy. Now, multicultural psychology has been around forever. When I was in graduate school, I took diversity and multicultural awareness as an elective because I thought it was kind of important. I was like, I probably need to know this stuff, about cultures and how they influence the way we think. Now it's a required course, which I think is great. It totally should be required because there is a difference. For example, binge eating, we see that different cultures treat binge eating differently. Francis Cecil Sumner was the first African-American to receive a PhD, and that was in 1920. Much of the early work looked at intelligence testing, and that's kind of it with regards to culture. In fact, we kind of got it off because we would say that people were dim or dull, when in actuality, they were probably very intelligent individuals. But if I take a test in Japanese, I'm going to fail that test. So people coming over from Ellis Island or giving tests to people that can't read, they can't show their ability to learn if it's not in their language. So it moved on to looking at learning styles, community belonging, spiritualism, and how being part of a community, even as much as with regards to religion, is being part of a religious community, does that influence your psychological well-being? Does that influence how you behave in certain circumstances? So it really has taken off in the last, I'd say, 10 years that we are studying much more than just culturalism as intelligences of different cultures. We've kind of gotten into the emotions of different cultures, the behaviors and how they affect individuals psychologically. So it's really picked up. So more contemporary psychology, you have the APA, which is the American Psychological Association, and then the APS, which is the Association for Psychological Sciences. This is founded in 1988. This was founded because basically they wanted to branch off because the APA was very much focused on clinical work. And so coming of the cognitive movement, the biological movement, people kind of pulled away and said, I'm studying how neurotransmitters affect aggressive behavior. I'm not really clinical. I'm not wanting to be part of clinical. So they pulled out. So if you are purely experimental and in the science side of psychology, you're probably only going to be an APA. If you're purely, APS, if you're purely clinical, you're probably only going to be an APA, but a lot of people cross over. So like I'm clinical, but I'm actually academic, but I'm clinical background, but I am part of the APS as well, because I also am a strong proponent of the scientific side of psychology. So biology and evolutionary psychology, biopsychology. There's also a newer field that's biopsychosocial. So it kind of pulls in the biology, the social side of psychology, kind of blends them together. Most individuals you find will be like biopsychosocial, behavioral, humanistic, psychotherapists. Like they're going to be all of those things. They kind of bring it all together. Biology is a structure and the function of the nervous system in relation to behavior. Things like biologists, doctors, neuroscientists, these are kind of the fields. Evolutionary psychology studies the extent that behavior is impacted by genetics. So kind of predicting the outcome of evolutionary theory, then making observations. Survival of the Prettiest is a book that was written that talks about, attractiveness and survivability. The criticism, however, is traits evolved under very different circumstances for humans. And a great example of that is humans that are living in extremely cold climates. They don't say, you're really hairy. I'm going to make sure to marry you and have babies because you're super hairy. And so you don't see that mate selection based on hairiness to try to get as hairy as possible to try to stay warm, because we're humans, we have heat and air. So you don't necessarily see the weeding out of traits or the weeding in of traits. So it works differently with humans. So there is a bit of a criticism with evolutionary psychology with the way that but we still do talk about how genes and genetic predispositions can definitely influence our behavior. Sensation and perception. We don't cover this chapter specifically, but you absolutely should check it out because it's really a very, very cool chapter. This talks all about how our sensations and perceptions can be manipulated or changed based on our cognitive beliefs, or just kind of on how our brain works. Like, how do we intake sensory information? Cognitive psychology focuses on thoughts, attention, problem solving, language, and memory. And we will talk about that. That is all throughout the textbook with cognitive, but we don't specifically talk about how the eye works, for example, which is amazing because you're actually seeing upside down with spots everywhere and little veins, but your body accommodates to that. When it gets to your brain, it reverses the picture, removes all the blind spots, and then projects for you a clear picture. So it's very interesting how that works. Also, perception of color, which is mind-blowing to me if you read about the color section. The fact that a color is actually the absence of others. So it's very kind of interesting. So you can read up on that, but we don't specifically cover this chapter. All right, so developmental psychology. Developmental psychology is a study of development across the lifespan. So Jean Piaget is perhaps still the biggest name in this field. He focused on children and young children and how they function very differently than adults. The changing population and demographics, though, we see kind of a shift in age with regards to what children are learning. And also we're seeing kind of additions to his theory because, people make he made this great theory. It was amazing. It was groundbreaking, but then he died. So we can't continue making changes to that theory. So if we think about it, an 8-year-old is exposed to more now than an 8-year-old in the 50s would have been exposed to with regards to conservation, for example, which we'll learn about conservation. So even though Piaget's theory isn't spot on 100% correct, it is still used as kind of the outline for how we see children developing. And we will learn specifically about Piaget. We will definitely talk more about Piaget. Personality psychology then came along. These kind of came out around the same time. It's not necessarily that, this came next and was a dominating field. These kind of all came out around the same time. They're just branches of psychology that somebody can choose to kind of go into. They're not really standalones. So psychology is part of part of developmental, obviously, but how we develop our personalities in itself became its own field because it is so vast, and also because there are so many theories within that field. So we have the 5-factor model talking about what kind of personalities we have, our traits. Freud believed, of course, in the psychosexual stages of development. We'll learn about that. So in the personality chapter, which we do cover, we'll learn about each specifically kind of how we develop who we are. But personality psychology basically focuses on patterns and thoughts and behaviors that make us unique and make us kind of who we are. Social psychology. Sociology is different than social psychology, very different, in that social psychology studies how the individual responds to the environment, whereas sociology studies the group. Social psychology focuses on how we interact and relate to others or to situations. A very, very famous study by Stanley Milgram conducted experiments in which they had individuals to shock other people based on getting incorrect or correct answers. The researcher believed that very few people would go up to much shocks because innately we don't want to harm others. But what we found was surprising, because we found that individuals, when being told to do something by an authority figure and when responsibility was removed from that person, they were actually willing to go to the highest shock on the panel. Now, the person who was getting shocked wasn't actually getting shocked. They were part of the experiment. So they were just kind of a voice from the background. They weren't actually getting shocked. But that study is really awesome. You should read about that study. Very, very famous study. It will come up later again in other classes. The study involved deep deception, and it's been redone today, but it's considered very unethical. So you actually couldn't do a real study, but media's done it. Like on the TV, they've done studies that were kind of like this. So, and there's even been a game show that has done something like this. All right, so if you want to make money in the field of psychology, IO psychology is where you go, okay? Industrial organizational psychology. IO psychology is a subfield that studies applies psychological theories, principles, and research to businesses and organizations. They save businesses big bucks, and so they get paid big bucks. And IO psychologists often work in personnel management, hiring, firing. They also may work with team management, like getting teams to work together, finding the best personalities that fit in the team. They create environments and increase productivity. They may do mediation between employees or between upper management employees. And also they conduct research in business settings to kind of tell. And we have people right now who are not IO psychologists that are popping into all of these schools everywhere saying, oh, we're going to help you to make a better online environment. And it's kind of like, you're not really a psychologist, so you're kind of not necessarily knowing what you're doing, but they're doing a good job. It's all right. But an IO psychologist, they're going to make the big bucks coming in, swooping in, and because they save money for the company. If they can prove that they're saving the company a bunch of money, they'll stick around. Health and sports psychology. Sports psychology is also a field of psychology that has lots of money if you can get the job. It's a very small field. I know there's lots of teams out there and stuff like that, but usually there's one psychologist per team. And usually they go for a psychologist, PhD usually. They don't necessarily have counselors per se, but they usually use PhDs or even psychiatrists. They kind of try to keep the players and individuals in line with motivation, things like that. Colleges usually have a sports medicine person involved with their athletic department who also includes the psychology aspect of things, maybe helping balance home life with the rigors of athletics. So health psychology focuses on health and the effect of the interactions of biology, psychology, and society. So health psychology, and the reason why these things are kind of tied together, is health psychology also looks at why we do the things we do. Like smoking, for example. Why do people smoke? Knowing the dangers of smoking, why do we smoke? Why do we still do it? What is so strong about that now reward that is stopping us from recognizing the later punishment? So, all right. So clinical psychology, this is what everyone thinks of when they think of psychology. They think of the clinical aspect of it. They think of mental health. the other stuff, they kind of go, huh, I didn't really think about that was part of psychology, and it very much is. But the clinical is the most known, I guess, when you start talking about psychology. Clinical psychology focuses on diagnosis and treatment of psychological disorders. Clinical is an applied area. Many clinicians are very active in research, however, but counseling is a little bit different. It's a similar discipline, but it focuses on the psychological health, more on psychologically healthy individuals. So it's kind of like, why would you go to counseling if you're psychologically healthy? Well, it's the same as, why do you go to the doctor for a checkup twice a year? Why do you go to the dentist twice a year to get your teeth checked? It's kind of mental health preventative help. So if you just maybe have 3 sessions a year just to sit down with a counselor and to kind of just check in, and I go weekly only because I think it's very good for my health, because my life is actually I go every couple weeks because my life is very complex. So it's good for me to have somebody that is objective, that has no judgment, that can kind of bounce ideas with me. So I can say things like, this is how I'm feeling, this is what I'm thinking, and they can come back with, well, let's challenge that thought. Whereas a friend may say, yeah, let's bust them in the kneecaps. Whereas a clinician may come back with, how does that help you? You know what I mean? So counselors are great. I love the concept of counseling, but counselors, however, do not work as much with severe psychological disorders. So you may have somebody, they may go see a psychiatrist, or excuse me, they may go see a psychologist, they move on to kind of a therapist, and then once they get everything regulated and everything's going well, then they may go start seeing a counselor. All right, forensic psychology, all this means is we work with the law. Working with the law. Forensic psychologists focus on the context of the legal system. So maybe working to get jury selection, guardian ad litem, custody cases, doing testing and measurement for individuals coming in to the prisons or working in a prison. Anything that has to do with working with the law or the system of law, that's what a forensic psychologist is. Now, when you say the word forensic psychology, people instantly think criminal profilers. We have one or maybe two. I know we have one criminal profile in South Carolina. There might be 2 now, I think. But point is, it's a tiny little job market. You may have profilers that work with the FBI and also with the CIA and other organizations or agencies, but it's a very small group of individuals. Most of the people that do forensic psychology are working in other aspects of the law. So careers in psych, there's so many careers in psychology. In order to work in higher education, you have to have a PhD. Not true. I have a master's in science. I have a master's in science, therapeutic intervention, master's in psychology science, and an emphasis clinical. So a master's in science, you can work in a 2-year institution. A master's in arts counseling is not accredited to work in a 2-year institution to teach. So you would need to have that master's in science or a master's in arts psychology. You could also have that, but a master's just in counseling, that doesn't actually qualify to teach in a 2-year institution. So if you're looking at thinking about teaching college, would be awesome. You want to look into that master's of science or master's of arts psychology. All right, so yeah, you don't have to have a PhD. Other careers outside of academia, we have about 26% of individuals with PhDs, hospitals, services, VA, nonprofit business, education, medical school, independent practice. Now, these are PhDs, okay? So, or PhDs or PsyDs, which is a clinical doctorate. When we start talking about careers, psychology can branch into so many careers. So for example, psychology can branch into working as managerial staff, marketing. People in marketing love people in psychology. Psychology is really, really strong in marketing. So that's chapter 1. I'm going to ask you guys to